Hi, my name is Allison Payette from 3sistersfabric.com. This video is a follow-up video to my previous one called the ABC method of borders and corners. That video showed you how I take care of the top borders and the bottom borders, but many of you have written and requested that I explain to you how I do the side borders then. Okay, I have two different ways I will take care of side borders. One, I will turn the quilt, and two, I will chunk the quilt. And I will decide which method I'm going to choose according to some of the variables that are on each individual quilt. In this video, I'm going to be covering how and why I turn a quilt. If borders are exceptionally wavy, I will opt to turn a quilt. It is easier for me to stitch out a border with better results if I can pin the quilt from side to side, if I can use my clamps from side to side and kind of pull out those waves across the whole border. If my border pattern that I've chosen is exceptionally complex, I will sometimes choose to turn the quilt because I don't feel like chunking those borders and having them trying to get them to match up again and again down the side of a quilt. It's easier for me to do it again in one pass. If there are multiple borders on a quilt, if there's two, sometimes three borders on a quilt, I will opt to turn the quilt. It is easier again for me to do those borders in one fluid pass, per border of course, than to chunk three multiple borders down the side of each quilt. So in this video I'm going to be demonstrating how I take care of it once I turn a quilt. First of all, as I am quilting down the quilt, I will do the top border completely. I'll have the corners and I'll do the border repeats in between, just like in the ABC video. I will do all of my ditch work, all of my quilting that I possibly can do, all the way down the quilt. As I am going, I will be basting the side borders in place. I will be using my channel locks to make sure that the borders are turning out nice and straight. I will use my long arm centering tape to make sure they are staying in the right position, and I will be basting as I work down the quilt. When I get to the bottom of the quilt, I finish the bottom border just like I showed you again in the ABC method of borders and corners. When all of that is done and I've done everything I can possibly do, and all that is left for me to do are the borders, the side borders, I unpin the quilt. Then I take the quilt over to our cutting table and I trim those side borders. I trim the backing and the batting fabric to 2 inches from the edge of the border. That is so that when I pin the backing fabric onto my leaders now, it will straighten that border out. There won't be any waving. If you just leave the backing fabric untrimmed, your border's just going to wave all over the place. It's a lot cleaner and a lot easier to just trim it and pin it on. Then your border turns out relatively straight when you repin it onto the leaders. As you can see here, I am in a standalone mode on my computer right here, but what I did is I tried to map out a somewhat wonky border. It's not super wonky because I trimmed my sides, and so the border is not terribly out of whack. The corner patterns that you see on the screen here and here, they are stitched. They are already on the quilt, but since I don't have a quilt here, I'm in standalone mode. I had to put some corners on the screen, and we're just going to pretend these are actually what we're seeing on a quilt. I am using my rose border and corner pattern. You can find those on my website at 3sistersfabric.com. And I'm going to, like I said, these patterns are not actually on my CAD at this point. They are on the quilt. But I am zooming in, and what I will do is I'm going to hit, in standalone here, I'm going to hit Alt-B, and I'm going to make a little boundary, tracing off the edge of this border corner so I can just kind of see where it's falling. On your Statler, on your actual literal quilt, you will go ahead and just create a boundary and use the head of your machine, and you will trace off. You'll use the head of your machine and you'll just trace off where that pattern is actually stitched out. This is just to give you an idea on where the border, where the corners actually are, so that you know you're not running over anything when you actually run your patterns. When you run your patterns, your border patterns. You just bear with me a little bit while I finish doing this. And as you can see, it's not a super picky thing. But okay, so that border is done and that border is done. Okay, and then the next thing I do is this is kind of the neatest trick of all, I think, when it comes to turning a quilt. I love this. I go to draw, well, I'm doing that on here. I'm going to draw sewable point-to-point line, or you can hit Alt-L in standalone mode. On your computer, on your Statler computer, you will want to go up here to point and click on point-to-point line. Then go over to your quilt with the head of your machine and find the end of that pattern, where the corner pattern ends on the left-hand side. Click on it there and go way out to the edge of your quilt, just somewhere, anywhere, it doesn't really matter. We just need a line there. And then make like kind of a check mark, just like that. The reason I do a check mark is it kind of gives you something decent to grab out here. Sometimes if you just draw a line, it's a little harder to grab the pattern later when you need to. Go over to the other side and let's do another line right there to where the end of the pattern starts. Okay, this is on your quilt. You are doing this with the head of your machine on the quilt, actually. Okay, and you're doing that. Now I am going to delete these corner patterns, because in actuality you shouldn't be able to see them on your screen. And all I have now is I have my quilt boundary for the borders that I mapped out. I have this little outside line showing me where my last pattern was stitched. Then I have these two nifty little check marks. They are pointing directly to where my border needs to run. The start of my border pattern has to start over here on the left, and the end of my border pattern has to end over here on the right. And these check marks are pointing directly to where the border needs to start and end. I selected both of those patterns. I'm right-clicking on them, and I am going to toggle them sewn. I do not want them to stitch out. Now I will click Alt-M and bring up the measure tool. I will hit the E for end snap, and I'm going to measure from right here, from that end to that end. And then I'm going to right click to get out of that measure tool. Or hit escape, sorry. But what that did is that pasted those measurements to the clipboard. Now I will go to my rose border pattern. I will click on repeat patterns. I'm going down to total width. And at this point too, I'm backing up. My border pattern has already been sized for these borders. That was done back when I did my top border and my bottom borders. So that's done already. If you want to know how I size my border patterns, go listen to the ABC method. But 4.5 inches is the height I needed for this particular border. I'm going to right click on the total width, and I'm going to paste my length measurement into that quilt, not the width measurement, because the length is what we want. I'm coming down to the square up angle, and I'm going to paste my angle. Then I will simply say, okay. They go on the screen exactly where my head is sitting, and that's just fine. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to select all these patterns, And then I'm going to hit F11. I want my end snap features. Okay, I want to be able to take this snap here and snap it over here to the end of that check mark. Then snap it over here to the end of that check mark. And it will snap right in place back to my original measurements. Creative Studio calculated the fact that I needed 1, 2, 3 repeats. It calculated the width and it calculated my square up angle. So all I had to do after those patterns were on the screen is drag them in place. Now let's just say I don't like the way these border patterns are sitting in this border. It looks like they are a little bit closer to the top than they are to the bottom. It's just kind of being a little fussy here, but it's just mostly to show you what you can do. If I zoom in, take off my end snap by hitting the E, I can drag this down a little bit, make it look a little better, a little more even in there. And then I'll go ahead and put my end snap back on by hitting my E key. Snap that border right to that one there. And now I think they're about perfect. And now they're ready for stitching out. Okay, now you've taken care of your top border. Or actually, this in fact is your left border. Let's roll down the quilt and go on down to do your bottom border, or in actuality it is your right border. Okay, and generally speaking, quilts borders are running around quilts in a clockwise direction. So do remember that when you get down and you're doing the other one, you're going to normally be measuring from the right side of the quilt to the left side of the quilt to get your square up angle. If you measure from the left to the right, your border is not going to be running in the same clockwise direction that the patterns were designed. Occasionally, patterns are designed to go in a counterclockwise direction, and you will want to keep that in mind. If it is running in a counterclockwise direction, you have to reverse the direction that you take these measurements. The borders will need to start over here and run to the left, and then when you get down to the bottom, they will start on the left and run to the right. But anyhow, I hope you enjoyed the video. Have a wonderful day, and feel free to check out our website at threesistersfabric.com. Thank you.